Today we have the right people who will be able to speak about the manuscript and about Lucia di Lammermoor. The first person I would like to invite here is Francesco Micheli, who is the artistic director of the festival Donizetti Opera, and I hope that he is here, Francesco Micheli. Okay, you are here. Sorry, I was wondering with my... Okay, Francesco, please. I leave you the podium.
Buonasera, buonasera a tutti. Good evening, everyone. I'm really glad to be here in New York in this amazing institution. Ricardo is more than a friend, is a colleague, is a partner in art. Davinia, don't worry. And so we decided to take this challenge to... I'm from Bergamo, like Gaetano Donizetti, and Bergamo is not a very famous city. When people outside think about Italy, normally they think about a mixture between Naples and Venice. But Bergamo is a very special way to be Italian. Yes, with fog, with pain, a romantic city, but in the literal meaning. So we thought that in this difficult time, we need another way to face the difficult time we live in because of Donizetti. Because Donizetti was a person witnessed the great change between the 18th and 19th century, speaking to the young people, telling them, you know, classicism, at the beginning of 19th century is failed, and we have to find new values, new challenges. And Donizetti was the right person. He was the first real romantic Italian artist. And year by year, discovering new operas that often we didn't know, we feel how is prophetic his work. For example, in next festival, we invite you, of course, in November, not a typical Italian month because it's really frozen in Bergamo, but the heart is really hot, and so you can really find a pleasure in our city, in our theaters, Teatro Sociale and Teatro Donizetti. And we have three operas, very different, because we have La Favorite, the French original version. We have Lion nell'imbarazzo, the first success of Donizetti, and we celebrate, after 2 centuries, the not lucky debut of Gaetano Donizetti in La Scala by means of Chiara e Serafina. And 3 different operas, 3 different flavors, but it's incredible, there is one clear connection. All of these 3 operas, written in 20 years, in a space of 20 years, are connected by the clear, difficult connection between the generations, fathers and sons, with different point of view and with the deep desire of young people to find their way in an area, living a situation so difficult for them. And Lucia, about the connection with the generation, about the space that young people have to find to find a purpose in their life is a clear masterpiece, because we witness Lucia, a sweet girl, a hero without any desire to be a hero. And I'd like to share, the emotional moment of the debut of this new production in Metropolitan House. I'd like to share with you some elements about Lucia, always stressing the prophetic skill of Gaetano Donizetti to feel the future without perhaps be aware of that, but with really a prophetic spirit. Lucia made her debut at the San Carlo Theater in Naples in 1835. In those days, the city, Naples, was devastated by a terrible cholera epidemic. I mean, to be a spectator of this show in this moment in Naples was something heroic, because you have to exit and, I mean, to face the cholera and go to the theater. And we pretty understand what that means. I mean, Europe, 1835, is traversed by a revolutionary movement. Italy itself does not exist. It is clear that the young people of that time were lost, surviving between courage and madness. Their bewilderment is picked up by artists like Donizetti, who channel all this energy into a new movement, Romanticism. Lucia di Lammermoor, in fact, speaks of desperate children, speaks of lack of freedom, speaks of need for peace, speaks of blood, speaks of loss of reason. So, I think you can follow me if I say there is a lot of affinity with the difficult times we are experiencing now. So, the presence of these precious papers, it disappeared. The presence of these precious papers has not only a great cultural value, a strong bond that goes beyond the distance of the ocean. We have great hope. Lucia can give a voice to beauty and the desperate need for happiness even to her peers today, from Italy to New York. In fact, the last project that we decided to build in our last edition of the festival, the inauguration of the festival is with a new opera, an electronic version of Lucia named Lu Opera Rave. We ask for three of the most important DJs and electronic composers in Italy, Mischeta, Protopapa, Hair, and they didn't know Lucia so far. So it's an educational project at first, but more as, I mean, if we read the libretto, when we witness the madness scene, it's really it's a very punk experience. So we think that this music, these tunes, these words are able to face the present and become a new kind of, performance. And that's our, the expression of our desire to share the pain of the youthness in this moment, not only in Europe, but in all our planet. So, grazie Gaetano to be present in these difficult times. E grazie a voi. Buona serata.
In Italy, we have two Lucia at the beginning of the 19th century. There is the Lucia of the Promessi Sposi, the Betrothed, the novel by Alessandro Manzoni, which is the most famous novel of Italian contemporary literature, and there is the Lucia of Donizetti. The Lucia of Manzoni is not able to speak about her desires. The Lucia of Donizetti, thanks also to her madness, is able to speak, to show a woman who is strong and able to speak about herself and to speak about what she wants. Of course, I am simplifying, but all the women of Donizetti are great examples of a new idea of womanhood and of what being a woman can mean in a contemporary age. And now I would like to, since we have the manuscript, not here but in the Klima box that is in our hall, I'd like to introduce Gabriele Dotto, who is the curator of the critical edition of Lucia di Lammermoor. So he knew already very well the manuscript. He worked on the manuscript. He knew very well how Donizetti worked on his music, on his character, and so this can be a way for us to go into the work of this wonderful composer. Please, Gabriele Dotto, I will leave you the floor, and let's welcome him.
So I'm going to do a two-pronged presentation. Mostly I'm going to talk about the nature of the autograph, which is absolutely fascinating because we have it here, and also a little bit about the nature of the opera itself. Donizetti, of course, as you know, born in 1797, which places him 5 years after Rossini, an avowed classicist, 4 years before Bellini, the next in line for a romantic composer. But Donizetti, as we heard earlier, really is the benchmark, the beginning of what really is Italian romantic music. Rossini, however, had already taken the world by storm by the time he was 24. Bellini would do the same by the time he was 25 years old. Donizetti's career grew much more slowly by 19th century standards, even though he composed much more feverishly. By the time he died at age 50, he had composed nearly 70 works for the stage. His breakout moment came in Milano in 1830 with Anna Bolena. He was 33 years old by that time, and by that time he had already composed 30 operas. But soon thereafter there followed a series of important works that launched the name throughout Europe, works like Elisir d'Amore and Lucrezia Borgia, so that by the time he came to compose Lucia di Lammermoor, he was riding the crest of a great wave of fame. Lucia di Lammermoor remains Donizetti's most popular and often performed serious opera. It has come to represent the emblematic high point of Italian musical romanticism and is a gleaming jewel in opera's bel canto crown. But Lucia was born under difficult circumstances. It was written for the Teatro San Carlo in Naples, a theater which had seen some of Donizetti's greatest successes, but which was at that time in a state of organizational chaos. In May of 1835, Donizetti, while waiting for official approval for a subject that he had chosen himself, and which he called La Sposa di Lammermoor di Walter Scott, the composer referred to the commission that governed the San Carlo as Gran Gabbia di Matti, a cage of madmen, and it's easy to see his point. The commission was also shackled by the royal censorship at Naples, which had a tendency to both be extremely strict and extremely inefficient. The censors had banned Donizetti's Maria Stuarda the year before, but only got around to doing that after the dress rehearsal. In circumstances like these, it's easy to see why Donizetti took matters into his own hands. He was unequivocal about it in a letter to a commission that he wrote in May of 1835, where his irritation spilled out into a wonderfully long single sentence of his demands. Quote, "Time is running out, and I assure you that I cannot remain much longer in such uncertainty, since I have other projects. Thus, either be so good as to authorize the poeta, Signor Camarano, to set to work without delay on the scenario of Lucia di Lammermoor, already presented and approved by the censorship, and in this case I think I can promise to finish the work by the end of August, without insisting on the 4-month period usually stipulated in my contract, or allow me to assume my legal position, returning the rights to me according to the contract." Period. Donizetti's sentiments were clear, and he received the approval that he needed. Salvatore Camarano got working on the libretto, and the composer, following close behind, began writing the music. The speed at which both of them worked is astonishing. Far from needing the original 4 months that Donizetti had stipulated, or even the 3 months that he promised in the letter that I just quoted, he finished Lucia di Lammermoor, orchestration and everything, in 5 weeks. His autograph score, housed in his hometown in Bergamo since 1985, and currently now here on display in New York, bears the date of 6 July on the last page. Nonetheless, his remarkable speed didn't do much good. The commission of the theater was on the verge of bankruptcy, and it delayed putting the opera into production. Then, when it was forced to start rehearsals, they found themselves unable to pay the singers, causing the prima donna promptly to go on strike. The Neapolitan public, meanwhile, were served a collection of stopgap productions and began to protest loudly. As Donizetti wrote to a friend, "Vesuvius is smoking and the eruption is near at hand." But then, as so often happens on the theater stage itself, there came a fairy tale ending. The opera finally appeared on 26 September 1835, even in time of cholera, as we heard, and was cheered to the rafters. As the composer himself reported, each piece was listened to with religious silence and then celebrated with spontaneous evviva. Lucia began its triumphant progress toward us. Here's the original costumes of that production. We've got Ashton, Edgardo, Ashton spelled very oddly because the Italians always had a difficult time with an SH and a TH, so he's written Asthon, a story for another time. And of course, Alisa and Lucia. Those are the original costumes. But although Lucia was a triumph in its premiere season in Naples, it did not, oddly enough, immediately establish its position as one of the composer's most popular operas. The late Donizetti scholar William Ashbrook thought that this may have concerned the reluctance of star sopranos to take on the formidable challenges of the title character's part. Whatever the case, in light of the huge success of the first run in Naples, it is certainly curious for us, in hindsight, that only 6 revivals of the opera took place the following year, in 1836. Firenze, Genova, Vicenza, Roma, and Venezia. And when Lucia finally reached Milano in 1837, it wasn't at the prestigious Teatro La Scala. Instead, the Milanese first heard Lucia at the tiny Teatro Re. In fact, in those first 2 years, Donizetti was competing with himself. His opera Buondelmonte, which had been quickly adapted after Maria Stuarda had been banned by the censors, was initially more popular than the two. Lucia would only reach La Scala the following year, 1838. And after that, Lucia began its hugely successful run as a mainstay of the romantic opera repertory in Europe and throughout the world. In fact, Lucia is one of the very, very few operas in all the repertory that has never fallen off the cartellone. It has been performed somewhere in the world every year since 1835. It's thus a particularly exciting occasion here at the Italian Cultural Institute of New York to be able to see Donizetti's own autograph full score of this timeless masterpiece. Notice the spelling of Lammermoor with just one M. Donizetti is Bergamasco. He does have some problem with double consonants. And I say it's exciting to see the autograph here, not just because of the antiquarian interest of seeing firsthand an original 2-century-old handwritten document by one of the greatest composers of the so-called golden age of Italian opera. I say this because Donizetti's musical autographs are very special. They are not mere fair copies of a definitive and final version of a score. Instead, in many ways, they are working documents in progress, a document that reveals to the musicologist and to the musician the fascinating flow of the creative process, of ongoing lifetime decision-making, of sometimes agonized choices that the composer has to make in various phases while preparing his opera. But what are these kinds of revealing traces that we can find as we examine Donizetti's autograph score? They can be of several types, and I'll illustrate some of them here. As you can imagine, when mapping out something as complicated as a full-length lyric opera with large vocal and orchestral forces, a composer doesn't dive straight away into copying out his complete full score. Once the opera's subject has been chosen, in this case The Bride of Lammermoor by Sir Walter Scott, whose novels had become popular throughout Italy after they were translated into Italian by Gaetano Barbieri. This is the frontispiece of the Firenze edition of 1826, but there was actually a previous edition in Milano in 1824 of Barbieri's translation. So just 5 years after the Walter Scott novels were published in England. Donizetti would then have sketched a few musical ideas once he had read the overall plot summary that the librettist had drafted. Then, as the librettist began to supply the composer with actual verses to be set to music, Donizetti would have begun to map out longer sketches, complete with a more fundamental shape of each musical piece, whether it be an aria, a duet, an instrumental passage, or a large vocal ensemble. With most composers, these sketches would then have been assembled or recopied into an overall continuity draft, something like the storyboard of a movie that you're all familiar with. This would contain the full opera from beginning to end, bar after bar, sketched out in a few musical staffs containing only the very basic instrumental line of the basses and some important vocal parts. To date, we have never found the continuity draft for Lucia. However, since Donizetti did not necessarily compose his operas in the strict chronological order in which the pieces appeared during the plot, he might have skipped around and sometimes added important solo pieces only at the last moment once he had been able to work with the cast of singers. It seems therefore possible that in some cases he went directly from his preliminary sketches to mapping out the full final score, farm-to-table approach, as it were. And here is where the study of the autograph full score starts to become especially interesting. Straight away, notice how the score is laid out. At the very top of the page, the first 3 lines are the highest strings, the 2 violins and the viola. And at the very bottom are the violoncello and the contrabass line. In the middle are all the wind instruments, and there in the bottom, above the basses, are the voices. For those of you who are familiar with a modern orchestral score, this is counter to the common practice of laying all the string parts down to the bottom, the voices in the middle, and all the wind parts at the top. There's a reason for this. The German composer Johannes Brahms used to say that when a young composer would send him a full score to examine, he would lean over his desk and put his arms over the middle of the score, leaving only visible the top and the bottom. In other words, the highest violin parts and the lowest bass. Because, Brahms said, if these outer voices are written well, and if they reveal a skillful interplay of counterpoint, then he knew that the rest of the score, the so-called fleshing out of the orchestration, was resting on a solid framework. And in Donizetti's generation, that's how they all were taught to lay out scores, whether it be Beethoven, Mahler, etc. This procedure also allowed the composer to easily map out what is called the so-called skeleton score. I'll show you a piece in a moment. Those outer string parts, as we mentioned, plus an occasional important other instrumental melody, and the main voice parts and singing text. This he does from beginning to end for each piece of the opera. Later he will circle back and fill out the orchestration. This fleshing out was not necessarily done all at one time, nor would all the orchestration on a given page be completed at one sitting. There are many examples of varying shades of ink, as well as internal discrepancies of marks and dynamics. These are some of the challenges that a critical edition tries to unravel. Frequent modifications, small and large, especially to vocal lines, reflect the fact that Donizetti was evidently adapting the autograph during rehearsals. Since Donizetti worked very quickly, these modifications in the autograph can be especially revealing to us. As we said earlier, a Donizetti autograph is more than a simple storyboard, as it were, and far more than a fair copy of a final decision. A Donizetti autograph is in some ways a work in progress. The composer was present at the rehearsals. At times he even conducted the first performances. The changes, cancellations, additions, indeed many different types of pentimenti, each tell a story. They reflect various phases and nuances of compositional process. Here, we may see a cut that was made before the full orchestra was fleshed out, which means Donizetti understood while writing the score that a section wasn't going to work as he had planned. Over here, perhaps a cut or a heavy alteration to a fully orchestrated section, which indicates that he realized when the rehearsals were already underway that maybe a singer in the premiere cast couldn't handle the part, or that perhaps a passage was unnecessarily suited to the way he had conceived it at his writing desk. Over here again, perhaps a passage that was only very lightly crossed out in pencil, which can indicate that a cut was made because of practical necessity at dress rehearsal, or even after the first three performances, but did not necessarily indicate a permanent cut. Rather, it might be a passage that Donizetti may have intended to restore if he ever got another chance at it in a subsequent production in another town. Here's an example of a section canceled out while still in skeleton score. As you can see, where all the cross-hatching is, whereas before we see a full orchestra on the left-hand side, When you get to all the cross-hatching, all we have is the bass line, a little bit of the voice parts, and a little bit at the top. This means he had already decided in skeleton score that this wasn't going to work, and this is a compositional decision, therefore, not something that happens while he's rehearsing. Here's another example. In this case, he decided to cut material before even bothering to provide any of the orchestral parts. Here, where the cross-hatching is, there's only the bass line and only the vocal part, but then he cuts and decides right away to skip. That would have happened before he ever got to rehearsals. Donizetti decided to cut material even in the latter case. We notice there's also a late-stage pentimento in the vocal part. This also would have happened not while he's sketching, but while he's in rehearsals and hearing what works best and what sounds best. Some such pentimenti can actually be quite substantial. And here instead is a cut made to a section that has been fully orchestrated. Oh, you can imagine the engraver trying to figure this out and trying to understand exactly what he's meant to do, or the copyist who's preparing the manuscript for the singers. But this is nothing compared to Puccini. We'll talk about Puccini some other time. Here's a section that's cut, interestingly, after the section had been fully orchestrated. You see that all the instruments are there, all the parts are there, everything is ready to go, but he's crossed it out. A decision of this type will have been made during rehearsals, when Donizetti decided that the passage needed to be tightened to improve the dramatic pacing of an overall section. Sometimes a cut that happens to a section like this requires him then to change the vocal parts afterwards because they no longer work from the beginning of the cut to the end of the cut. And again, that is something that speaks to us to say, this is part of a compositional process, a decision made very late in the game, maybe just a few days before the show is supposed to go on stage. There are also cuts that are indicative of very late decisions that would seem to have been made to music actually performed at the premiere, maybe all of the premiere performances. Cuts that would seem to have then been trimmed later on. If the cut was made before other manuscript copies of the score were prepared to circulate to other theaters, we can be sure that they were performed on stage. However, when the music appears in one of the sets of scores that were copied, that they were never performed on stage. However, when the music appears in one of the sets of scores that were prepared to aid the theater archivists during the rehearsals, then we know that it was performed. Here is an example of a very short cut which contains music that appears in the very earliest manuscript copy also used at Naples and the one used in Milano in 1838. Since this reflects music that was heard by the audiences at the first run of performances, this is a section for Lucia after the mad scene before rolling back in to the closing part of the number. This therefore reflects something of his original concept and it was performed on stage. As such, in the critical edition, we have reinserted the music as an optional cut, allowing the conductor to decide whether he or she wishes to perform the opera as it was done on opening night. There are also some cases, fascinating, in the autograph that appear to be indication of Donizetti writing notes to himself for future reference. Like this indication regarding a possible substitution that he made not for the San Carlo, which was a huge theater with an enormous orchestra and didn't have any problems in finding musicians, but for possible future productions in smaller theaters. You see what he writes at the bottom? He says, "Quando vi è arpa, si tralascia al secondo clarinetto l'arpeggio, cioè per 32 battute. When the harp is available, omit the second clarinet part for 32 bars." You see that the clarinet up here at the top is also playing the same arpeggios that the harp is playing here. There's the harp, and there's the clarinet up here. He's saying they shouldn't both play. If you can afford a harp player, then use a harp. But if you can't afford a harp player, then give it to the second clarinet. It's interesting that he would write this in his autograph. He's looking forward to it going to smaller theaters. In this huge forest of cuts, alterations, and pentimenti, one especially significant change stands out. And it is a puzzle we have at long last definitively been able to resolve over the course of the research for the critical edition. The curious case of the glass harmonica. I apologize for the title, but I've been binge watching Perry Mason, and it just comes. There's a long-standing bit of Lucia lore that involves the mysterious disappearance of the glass harmonica from the score. This instrument was hugely in vogue in those years for chamber music. The famous violinist Niccolò Paganini said it was a celestial voice. It was employed in operas and ballets as well to generate otherworldly effects. Hence, its choice to accompany Lucia's mad scene was not exceptional. It was not an experiment. Whether the instrument in question was keyboard actuated with a mechanical solution for setting the glasses in vibration, as designed by Benjamin Franklin several years earlier, or whether the performer at Naples grazed the bowls with his fingertips is not clear. For those of you who may never have heard the eerie sound of a glass harmonica, here's a sample using a modern motor-driven version of the Franklin glass harmonica. What's amazing about this instrument, for any of you who have heard it in a theater, whether it's a small space or an enormous space, it fills the entire hall. And even though it's down in the buca, it's down in the orchestral pit, you can't tell where the sound is coming from. It's really quite amazing. When I heard it at Covent Garden, where it was on stage and visible, and again at La Scala, where they put it in a palco, it surrounds you and the sound seems to come from behind. It's really an amazing effect. So, in Donizetti's autograph, what's in it? Well, here's where things start to get complicated. The glass harmonica part is crossed out. See, harmonica. There's the voice, that's what she is saying, see? But it's lightly crossed out. I'll give you a close-up here, crossed out there. But why? Was the part too difficult to play? The answer is absolutely not. For Donizetti's opera Elisabetta al Castello di Kenilworth in 1829, he had written a glass harmonica part that was wildly virtuosic. The armonico part in Lucia is very tame by comparison. Here's a sample of the complexity that can be achieved by the other type of glass harmonica I mentioned, individual water-filtered glasses played with just the fingertips. Sorry to end that in the middle of a cadence, but we need to get forward. So you see, it wasn't a matter of it being too complicated at all. Something went wrong in the days leading up to the premiere, leading Donizetti to cross out much of the glass harmonica part in his autograph score and replace it with an alternate, though somewhat simplified, flute part. This latter version, as you see at the top, I've done a close-up again of the autograph. We have the armonico here at the bottom, crossed out lightly, and up at the top, in very light, later ink, you'll see the word, under where it says larghetto, go down 3-4 lines, you'll see solo, and there's a flute part. See the flute in the beginning, 4 lines down. And you start the flute later with a different color, the same ink that we used to cross out that part. This latter version, the last-minute substitution of the glass harmonica with a flute, is what the first audience in Naples actually heard. And then, by sheer inertia, the flute, not the glass harmonica, entered the performing edition. But recent research has revealed that the change was not an artistic decision. Some of you who are passionate about Lucia know that in the 1960s there was an experiment to reconstruct and to use the glass harmonica because the facsimile of the autograph was available. However, no one thought that it was a permanent decision. It was done as an experiment, but they assumed that Donizetti, for artistic reasons, had removed it. So it was simply a stopgap experiment. What we've shown now is that actually it probably should be the favorite instrument. As it happens, the glass harmonica was removed from the score of Lucia for reasons that are not musically motivated. The player, a certain Mr. Domenico Pezzi, had even rehearsed the part with Fanny Tacchinardi, the first singer who created the role of Lucia, both in studio rehearsals and in the theater with full orchestra. But earlier in the same year, Pezzi had a run-in with the San Carlo Theater over his services. After having performed in a ballet entitled Amore Psyche innumerable times, according to the lawsuit, his glass harmonica part was at a certain point substituted, prophetically, by a flute. The court papers housed in the Naples State Archives make for very entertaining reading. Pezzi, a freelance artist who was paid for each performance, maintained that the financially troubled theater management ended his services in mid-run to avoid paying further fees. The management rebutted that Pezzi had left town unannounced at one point to play another gig, forcing them to make a substitution, and thereafter the substitution remained. However, if the player's reliability had been the only issue, it is doubtful whether Donizetti would have held several rehearsals with the glass harmonica before making a substitution. What is much more probable is the fact that Pezzi may have entered into litigation with the theater right at that moment. So whatever the motivation was, Donizetti decided, or he was advised, to make a substitution before the opera premiered, choosing the same solution, a flute, as the San Carlo had in the ballet mentioned above. Following on all this recent research, we in the new critical edition recommend that the glass harmonica be used as the instrument of choice, and in fact it will be used at the Metropolitan, I've understood, rather than adopting the fallback solution of a flute accompaniment, which was, as we have seen, a choice generated for mere pragmatic reasons. Oh, by the way, in the late 18th century, many doctors advised against the glass harmonica, saying they felt it could make both the players and the listeners insane. Which brings us to the mad scene. Now, Donizetti famously wrote a number of memorable mad scenes, and the topic has fascinated critics and scholars, some of whom have even wanted to see traces and reflections of Donizetti's own oncoming mental problems as models for the extremely effective way, and according to some writers, realistic way in which he depicts the oncoming madness. In a recent top 10 list of operatic mad scenes, including such classics as Wozzeck, Peter Grimes, Hamlet, and Boris Godunov, the number one position at the top of the list went to Lucia di Lammermoor. As one critic who compiled that list wrote, "It doesn't get much better than this quarter-hour slice of harrowing heaven." And it's not only musicologists and music critics who were fascinated by this. Just look at this scholarly paper from the Yale Journal of Biology and Medicine, Donizetti and the Music of Madness, of Mental Derangement, Anna Bolena, Lucia di Lammermoor, and the Composer's Neobiological Illness, where they posit that his oncoming mental derangement due to neurosyphilis created the opera's greatest scenes of psychosis. Bit of a stretch, but I'm not a biologist. Lucia, of course, is a fragile character to begin with. Her condition is certainly not helped when her brother threatens to haunt her like a ghost if she doesn't marry his ally, Arturo. The grisly offstage murder of her husband leads to this sublime scene in which Lucia, apparently completely unaware of the bloody tragedy she's just committed with her own hands, gives in to sheer musical extravagance in which her psychoses alternate with occasional awarenesses of reality. Donizetti's own structure of the scene is more than sufficient to render a quarter hour of wonderfully effective drama. But something curious happened on its way to the 20th century. The mad scene, cadenza. As many of you certainly know, a long cadenza accompanied by the flute has become a central attraction in this extended mad scene. Funny thing is, it had nothing to do with Donizetti, and indeed is very far from anything Donizetti would have considered stylistically or musically appropriate in his day. This cadenza with the flute has become the most famous single moment in the entire opera. In fact, it is one of the most famous moments in all of opera. It has long been suspected that this cadenza dated from a period after the composer's death, but how long after was not known until very recently, when research by the Milanese scholar Romano Pugliese demonstrated beyond any doubt that the cadenza was written in the late 1880s, almost 40 years after Donizetti had died, for the young soprano Nellie Melba, probably by her singing teacher. In light of this, it's no surprise that the cadenza is unlike any cadenzas we know from the time of Lucia. It's much too long. In some recordings, it lasts almost 3 minutes of improvisation. It offers a kind of vocal styling and an elaborate florid conception of female madness that are admirably suited to the time of its composition, the late 19th century, but which clashes in many ways with Donizetti's more restrained conception. And indeed, it clashes with the bel canto style of the 1830s. So what did Donizetti prescribe? Here's the autograph. It's all the way here at the end. The cadenza is right there. A few lines up. I'll show it to you in more detail. And here it is in printed music, so it's a little easier to see. There's her part where she says sarà the first time. In fact, there's a fermata missing, there's a punto coronato missing over the penultimate note. But that's all he writes. Now, of course, Donizetti's indication of arpeggios under a fermata is a standard cue for the singer to improvise some sort of cadenza. But back in Donizetti's day, what would that have been? Most likely something like this example that comes to us from the oboist Henri Brode, who published a Fantaisie sur l'air di Madame Persiani dans Lucia di Lammermoor for Donizetti in 1839. Hold on, I'll come back to that. So the first part of it, up to the fermata, is what Donizetti wrote, more or less. And then the rest of it is apparently what Tacchinardi, who had created the role, actually sang with those leaping thirds, and then another flourish, a fermata, and a flourish at the end. La Persiani, known as Tacchinardi Persiani, had created the role at Naples, as I said, and sang in Paris in 1837. However, by the 1860s, a different kind of female vocalism was coming into vogue, and several famous interpreters of Lucia experimented with more elaborate cadenzas. And there's also a hint in Donizetti's score that may have prompted some of the people to think of using the flute. Here at the bottom, he writes, "Se non si vuole fare niente del flauto, si può fare invece voce." So in other words, he already says, if you don't want to improvise together with the flute, you can do something on your own. So that may be where people got the idea that maybe they should do a longer piece with the flute. Many famous interpreters then experimented with these cadenzas, but Melba's very extended cadenza of a half century later became an instant hit and was even much expanded in later years by a number of famous sopranos. I'll play just one of these examples because I think I'm going over time. Uno de YouTube. There's also a callous recording, but you can find thousands. There's an interesting historical fact that by the late 19th century, these cadenzas had become so elaborate that they were literally show stoppers, in the sense that they stopped the show. After all, bear in mind the structure of Lucia. After she has her mad scene and leaves the stage, the scene changes, and the last 20 minutes of music of the opera belong to the tenor. Furthermore, it is some of the most beautiful music ever written for a tenor, Fra poco m'è ricovero and Tu che a Dio spiegasti l'ale. And as the tenor commits suicide, the curtain falls to thunderous applause for him. So regardless of the opera's title, in some ways Lucia becomes, at the end, a tenor's opera. As you can imagine, that did not sit well with a number of prima donnas, and we have evidence of some late 19th century performances in which Lucia starts her mad scene, attacks a hugely long cadenza, falls to the stage to wild applause, and curtain, end of show. And to heck with the plot line. In recent years, after the publications of our findings, some sopranos have tried to adopt a more restrained, more historical style. So, with regard to the cadenza, hold on. I'm trying to go to the next slide. Oh, because I'm still. tornare dentro. Ci sono? Sì. Ottimo. Oops. So, with regard to the cadenza, what a way to ruin a joke, right? Is Melba now toast? No, not at all. A great many opera goers still love the lengthy cadenza. It's my understanding it will be sung beautifully at the Metropolitan. We'll be able to hear it. Immortalized and kept alive through numerous recordings through the 20th century, from Calais to Sutherland to Sills and so forth. Sometimes these things take on a life of their own, and beloved traditions born of later performance practice will persist, even if these traditions began many years after the composer died and in different musical times and tastes. And finally, the sextet. We cannot close out this little journey. This is a caricature from 1900 from the Bertarelli archive. And I really love it because among composers, when they would do a sextet or a quintet, they would all come to the front. This is in the gaslight era, before electric lighting. So we actually literally had gaslights to the bottom. And to get an even balance in the voices, they line up with what Rossini called a campo di cavoli of singers. So they all have an even, this shows the campo di cavoli to great effect. We cannot close out this journey without mentioning this wonderfully written moment, and equally famous in this masterpiece, in which Lucia's true love crashes the wedding, all action stops, the 6 characters simultaneously express their innermost thoughts. And speaking of madness, one Milanese critic at the time quipped, 6 people all talking at the same time. No wonder Donizetti went mad. This is another example of a piece that took on a life all of its own. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th century, the Lucia Sextet was among the most performed ensemble pieces in recitals and concerts. And when the recording industry and later the film industry came into their own, this was among the first pieces ever recorded. Few people today are aware that long before the actual talking pictures became a reality in 1929, there were numerous inventions and attempts to synchronize image and sound. Indeed, when Edison first promoted his kinetoscope in 1888, he stated that his goal was to be able to record a complete Wagner opera as a movie in 1888. In this delightful example, singers and actors, all'ultimo poi, singers and actors are pantomiming to the famous recording with Enrico Caruso. They even chose an actor that looks like Enrico Caruso, but of course it's not the original singers. They would have had to pay them too much money. We'll listen to just the end of it. So just to get rid of the myth that there were silent movies, that were never really silent movies. The Caruso recording used in the basis for this movie pantomime was famously successful, and it became known in the popular press as the $7 sextet, $7 to buy the cylinder. To understand the context of what that nickname meant, bear in mind that $7 in 1908, if we adjust for inflation, would be almost $220 today. Thus, the possibility of hearing this famous recording in a public context of a moving image and sound display for only a few pennies doubtless added to the attraction to a broader audience of the spectacle. Oh, and by the way, as long as we're talking about the later spurious interpolations, I had you hear the soprano, that Donizetti did not write, that high D flat that the soprano sings at the end on that recording, not there. There she is at the top. The very top voice of the word tempo. She sings from A after D flat. She doesn't go on. But that's another opera tradition that composers had no control over. If people wanted to hear the high note, the singers gave them their high note. And so, there we have it. One of the most beloved and performed operas in all the repertory, which in so many ways had a later performing history as interesting as the opera itself. and it was all launched by the wonderfully creative mind of our dear Gaetano. Research into the critical edition of the operas of Gaetano Donizetti began in 1988 in Bergamo, published by Casa de Corti with the invaluable support of the Comune di Bergamo and the priceless collaboration of wonderful archival collections like that of the Biblioteca Mai in Bergamo. Here was an article in the Echo di Bergamo at the launch. I had so much more hair then. The first volume came out 30 years ago, and to date we have published 16 volumes with 3 more on the way by 2024. Since 1994, the critical edition has been granted the denomination of Edizione Nazionale, and we've been able to work closely with both the Fondazione Donizetti and more recently with the Donizetti Festival of Bergamo. This past December, the critical edition of Lucia di Lammermoor was finally published, edited by my colleague, Roger Parker, and myself. I'll be frank, some parts of the job have nearly driven us mad as well. But this will add yet another new chapter for singers, conductors, scholars, and opera lovers to discover new facets of this opera, to launch new and creative interpretations and stagings, to continue the wonderful journey of this masterpiece, nearly 190 years after it first hit the stage. There is no need to underscore the magnificence of this timeless operatic masterpiece, but I do hope I've been able to convey to you some idea of the excitement of the opportunity to view Donizetti's original handwritten score and what that represents. I'm an archival nerd, but even for the layperson, the chance to view this document is thrilling. Opera is meant to be performed. It lives through its interpretation on stage or in the concert hall. And every interpretation should be new, fresh, and different. But it all gets its start from this wonderful original conception, documented and frozen in time on manuscript paper, with all its evidence of the creative process available to us and to future generations to examine, to interpret, to reinterpret. My thanks go to everyone involved in the complex operation of bringing this sublime artifact to be placed on view here for New Yorkers to admire. And my thanks to all of you for patiently listening.
Thank you so much, because we understood even better how much Donizetti was and is still alive in his manuscripts that are like a laboratory, not just a copy, a final copy. And then even after his death, because in a way he's inspiring even new notes, new passages of the operas, and then in the critical edition that are able to go back. And it's wonderful that the work on the manuscripts, it's a work on all the operas written by Donizetti, not just one. I think that we can introduce a very brief video by Maria Elisabetta Manca, who is the director of the Civic Library Angelo Mai, where you worked, and who gave us the manuscript. It's just 90 seconds.
A Bergamo, tra le Alpi e la pianura, in prossimità di Milano, in una magnifica piazza rinascimentale, sorge un grande edificio palladiano. All'interno è custodita la Biblioteca Civica Angelo Mai, la più antica istituzione municipale di questa città. La Biblioteca Angelo Mai, sorta alla fine del Settecento per volontà del cardinale Giuseppe Alessandro Furietti, conserva un patrimonio estremamente ricco ed estremamente vario, che consiste non soltanto nel patrimonio librario, manoscritto, ma anche in opere d'arte, monumenti, musiche, iconografie e documenta e testimonia la storia della nostra città. All'interno del ricco patrimonio della biblioteca, un importante nucleo musicale accoglie anche la partitura originale manoscritta da Gaetano Donizetti della Lucia di Lammermoor, che per la prima volta attraverserà l'oceano per raggiungere New York in occasione della rappresentazione presso il Metropolitan Opera House. È un onore per la città, che nel 2023 sarà insieme a Brescia capitale italiana della cultura, poter far conoscere la creazione originale e il lavoro del compositore che più l'ha fatta conoscere nel mondo.
So thank you very much to the Angelo My Library. And by the way, we had some images of Bergamo Alta, because Bergamo is divided in Bergamo Bassa, Low Bergamo and High Bergamo. The Bergamo Alta is one of the most beautiful small cities in Italy. It's a sort of masterwork, really, of Renaissance and post-Renaissance architecture. And speaking of how much Donizetti is alive, I am very happy to introduce Aranzazu Escudero de Zuloaga, who is the president of the American Friends of the Donizetti Opera Festival, and she will bring a sort of a saluto of this association. Please.
Thank you, Fabio. Well, I think it's marvelous. It's absolutely marvelous to be together with all of you here today at the opening of this exhibition. After listening Professor Dotto explaining this wonderful and complete explanation about the manuscript, and also celebrating the beginning of the Donizetti Spring in New York. I'm here to present the American Friends of the Donizetti Opera Festival, that is a non-profit organization with scope is to promote the Donizetti Opera Festival and to encourage the opera lovers in the United States to support and to contribute with the festival by attending the festival and all the events related to the festival. Then likewise, the American Friends of the Donizetti Opera Festival has a specific scope, educational purpose, which is to create a new generation of artists in the United States who has a better and deeper knowledge of the Donizetti works. And well, this is, we are here. I hope you can, any one of you can correspond with me anytime, and I'll be delighted to speak with you with the purpose and the success of the foundation. Thank you very much.
If I'm not wrong, I think that one of the projects is to bring some American singers to Bergamo, because the technique is different, so they can learn in Bergamo how to sing, and I think this is wonderful, wonderful project, this bridge between the States and Italy, and in particular the Donizetti Festival. The last part of this evening will be conducted by the conductor. Sorry, I mean, we are so happy to have here Maestro Riccardo Frizza, who will conduct Lucia di Lammermoor at the Met, and I will leave the podium to him also for a little performance. But before that, I would like very much to say thank you to Floriana Tessitore, who is there, who is strictly connected to the festival, and without her this evening would not be possible. And I've seen now our Vice-Consul, Riccardo Cursi, and I am very proud to have also here the representative of the Consolato. Thank you very much, Riccardo, for coming. Please, thank you very much for coming, for being here today.
So good evening, everybody. It's an honor to be here and finally be able to bring in New York the score that maybe you don't know, but is supposed to come to the United States before some Italian patron decide to pay to keep it in Italy. So originally it was supposed to come in the United States. Yes, this honor is also because we're doing this new production of the Metropolitan Opera. When there is a new production, it's always a big moment for the city, for the opera house. So I don't know if it's my mobile phone, but I don't think so. Yes, it's mine. I put it in the flight mode, but anyway. So this new production is what we're trying to do at the Metropolitan Opera is to renew the repertoire. They want to renew the repertoire, so the proposal will be very innovative and very different than what we are used to see, at least in the last 30 years at the Met. But musically, speaking musically, there is some news. I will bring in the score what the critical edition, not everything, but most of the correction that Gabriele Dotto and Roger Parker found out in the score. So we finally fixed the very old material of the Met with some harmonies that were wrong, and we fixed it out finally with also the help of Dan Saunders. It is one of my music staff that will be playing the piano afterwards. And it was very interesting to listen to Gabriele Dotto because he was talking about cuts, he was talking about how Donizetti was changing even the day before the performance and even after the opening, and even after in Paris and even in London was cutting out the Raimondo aria, for example. So I was flexible with cuts and doing modifications. And for me, in the last 22 years, I'm working very constantly with the critical edition. I started before with the Rossini edition. Now I'm very involved with Francesco in the festival, Donizetti Festival. So how important is it to work with the critical edition? Because we discover every single day the process of composing by Donizetti, and we discover every day how great he was, not as a musician, because everybody that knows that Donizetti was a great musician. Everybody knows Eliseo d'Amore, Don Pasquale, Lucia, but the great dramaturg was Donizetti before to be a great musician. How innovative was in the theater. I was bringing the women put in the center of the drama. I was analyzing the women with the 3 queens or the 4 queens, better. There was 4 opera by the queens, by the Tudors. Lucia, Maria di Rohan. So it was a feminist ante litteram, I want to say. If you consider Walter Scott was writing this novel, and Edgardo was the center of the novel, but Donizetti changed the point of view. He put Lucia in the center. Also thanks I think it's my opinion, so think of the cadenza of the Melba. Because why I say exactly, maybe it's not in the style of Donizetti, maybe it's not what Donizetti was desiring, but my opinion is also that thanks to this cadenza, we were able to have in the cartellone so far, every single year, every single season, Donizetti, Lucia di Lammermoor. So, sometime we have to decide. Perform, of course, they study the scores, they are the musicologists, they are the philologists, but we are the interpreter. We are the people that will take their lesson and put it on stage. It's a different job, you know, to be a scholar and be a performer. So we have to take decisions. The decision we took is to keep the cadenza of Melba at the Met of the new production. Also because, you know, for a soprano, it's not easy to say, look, take out of this beautiful 12 minutes of solo and just do start one bar cadenza as Donizetti wrote. After 2 centuries, it's not easy. You know, they want to show up. They want to also to compete with the greatest singers of the past. So I invite you to come to the Metropolitan because I think it's in my point of view, it's a great production, very new, very different. It's make you reflect, you know, how it's possible to have a new Lucia. Also because it's a Lucia very contemporary. So it's not a Lucia of the past, it's a Lucia of today. How modern is Lucia is even if was composed in 1835. So please come. Thank you. Bye. Sorry. I want to introduce Alexandra Nowakowski and Dan Saunders. Please come in. So Alexandra Nowakowski is a very young soprano. It's American, Polish-American soprano. That she covers the role of Lucia at the Metropolitan Opera, so she's ready to jump in case of the colleagues get sick or whatever. And Dan Saunders is, what I say, is a great friend and is in my music staff from my Met debut. So we know each other already with so many production together here at the Met. She's going to sing Regnava nel silenzio, the first Lucia's aria. Okay.
l'ombra mostrata